All right. I'm going to share my screen here. Please ignore the 6,000 tabs at the top. I'm a tab person. I just leave them all open. All right. So this is my dissertation proposal defense. It is titled Maternity Leave's Impact on Female Educators, a Potential Explanation for Gender Disparity in School Administration. And I'm going to start my little timer here, so I try to keep track. Just a brief introduction about myself. I know we did introductions, but I currently work at the West Shore School District. I'm in a middle school, and I'm a gifted teacher there. I also do social studies and a little bit of ELA as well. A brief introduction. I am proposing to do a qualitative exploratory study using grounded theory, and I want to collect data via individual semi-structured interviews, primarily focusing on K through 12 female administrators. This study has two seemingly separate problems in K through 12 education that I'm tying together. The first is the low rate of female administrators despite a high rate of female teachers. The second is that there's little to no existing maternity leave policies in school districts. And these two problems are not just for the state of Pennsylvania, they're across the entire country. The large number of female teachers, it's remained constant. The U.S. Department of Education released a study. Now, this was back in the 90s, but the numbers still hold today. I have checked various statistics. The past 120 years, as of the 90s, the ratio of female to male teachers, it was basically 75-25, and that's what it is today. It has risen and dipped a little bit, but it has never been where there are more male teachers than female teachers. It's always been majority female. As far as maternity leave policy issues go, there really isn't a specific policy. And when it comes to things with maternity policies, there's a lot of bias in the history of the country, but specifically in education as well. And a great example of this is the Cleveland Board of Education versus LaFleur. She was a teacher in the Cleveland school district. And once she became pregnant, she was asked to leave her job. And I believe she had just entered her second trimester, so she hadn't even had her child yet. That was very common, not just in Cleveland, but across the country, that once a woman or if a woman became pregnant, she would be asked to leave her job. It was not guaranteed that she would have a spot when she returned. It was just sort of, now you're moving on to something else. Her and several other teachers did bring a court case against the Cleveland Board of Education in 1973, made it all the way up to the Supreme Court in 74, where they sided with the women and against the Cleveland Board of Education and said those policies were unconstitutional. This court case eventually led to the Pregnancy Discrimination Act, which came out in 1978. Among other things, it essentially says that you can't fire a woman for being pregnant. However, there's a lot that it left still open. As far as maternity leave goes in the country, the US doesn't have any formal policies, and there's lots of criticism that this country gets because of this. A great example is Hennick in 2003 did a study, a comparative study, and there's just so much in there. But one thing that really sticks out is that France had passed a mandatory maternity leave policy paid in 1913. So over 100 years ago, France was requiring employers to pay their employees out on maternity leave. It's now 2024, and the US still does not have a policy like this. A second example, in 2019, UNICEF did a study of the world's 41 richest countries. Of course, the US is a part of that. And the US actually ranked last in just about every category. And we are also the only country on that entire list that does not have any type of paid leave. What the United States does have is FMLA, the Family Medical Leave Act. This was passed in 1993, so just over 30 years ago, 31 years ago. And it's a policy, a federal policy that mandates minimum requirements that employers must provide, which include for maternity, but it's not specifically for maternity. It can be for any type of illness or family issue. It basically just ensures that a woman receives health care and a job upon her return after 12 weeks. If she's out for more than that, FMLA no longer applies. There's other stipulations that surround this, and Barnes in 2013 did a study where he identified that only about half the country is actually protected by FMLA. Now, I do want to note for this particular study, FMLA is automatically applicable to both private and public schools because they're in education. However, one of the stipulations is that you must work for your employer for over a year. So if a teacher were to join a new school district and become pregnant and go out on maternity leave, she does not qualify for FMLA, even though the country says that it's mandatory that education provide FMLA. As far as unequal gender representation in administration goes, an incredible study that I looked at was Kate Roosman-Ree. She wrote a book and did a very large study on the history of the female principal. And it's very interesting to look back for the hundreds of years in the United States. Teaching and child rearing were both viewed as female jobs, and it was very acceptable for women. They would have children, they would teach the children. Even if a female didn't have children, it was still okay for her to teach because that was just sort of in the same realm. Unfortunately, in the late 1800s, as education became more professional, if you will, when it was mandatory for children to go to school, the government had to get involved and start creating all sorts of different positions in the administrative world. And then that's where we see that women were sort of kept to teaching, and the males filled in those positions to manage the schools. And Roosman-Ree calls that a gendering of the teaching profession. A great example of this is in 1973, out of the entire country, only 1% of high school principals were female, which is a crazy number to me. Currently in 2024, female superintendents are only in the 20%. I believe the latest number is that they're up to 24%, but nothing over that. So still a very small amount of female superintendents in the country. Currently, this is the most recent data from the NCES. They have done a new study, but I don't think that data is released yet. They do them about every 2 to 4 years. There's 57.4% of principals that are female and 42.6% are male. When you just look at those two numbers, it does look like there's a lot of improvements that have been made because there's more female than male principals. However, if you really dive into the history behind the data, it's not so great. We still have a large disparity there. In 2007 to 2008, that school year was actually the first year that females crossed that 50% threshold, and they only did it by 0.6%. And since then, it hasn't really grown too terribly much. Another thought is when you look at the fact that over 75% of teachers are female, they're definitely not proportionately represented in that 57% female principalship, and certainly not in the 27% female superintendents. And when I talk about female teachers here moving into the principalship, teachers, you have to start off as a teacher to then move into administration. So there's like the clear flow there as you start off as a teacher and then work your way up. Some studies there are many studies actually, not just some, and they look at gendering in educational administration, both higher ed, public education, K through 12. There's a whole bunch out there. Some that specifically apply that I decided to pull out for this presentation is Ahmad in 2017 did a very interesting study on gender disparity in higher ed. And he was able to identify that there were specific instances when women having children prevented their career as a tenure track professor. This direct correlation and the assessment has not been done yet for K through 12 education. So it does apply at the higher ed level. And I'm looking to see if this type of thing would apply here, the K through 12 level. Another study by Sanchez and Thornton said that female career goals or aspirations related to educational leadership are impacted by family obligations. And this is because women are often expected to be the primary caregiver, regardless of the job that they have. And in my pilot study, I was finding this over and over again as well. Shake Shaft found that women face stereotypes when they enter into educational administration. They're viewed as unable to discipline students, they can't supervise adults properly, they can't provide the proper constructive criticism, they're not good with money, they can't manage finances, they can't function in a political field. All of these were actual points that she had found in her study. And lastly, Glass uncovered that female administrators spend an average of 7 to 10 years as a teacher, but males spend significantly less at about 5 to 6 years. And so that from that pool of 25% of male teachers that only spend about 5 to 6 years in a classroom, they're able to then jump into administration. When females eventually make it into the administrative field, they're often called it's seen as like too late to have a thorough career if they want to go all the way up through to the superintendency. Studies outside of education have been done in terms of gender and administrative positions. Multiple scholars conclude that maternity leave and motherhood in general negatively impacts the trajectory of women's careers. And other scholars identified that just the stigma of motherhood can negatively impact careers in several different ways. The restriction on employment, not qualifying for promotions, and limited or no salary increase. And again, in my pilot study, I did find some of this occurring. No study has yet to isolate maternity leave policies and their influence on the gender disparity among female admin in K through 12 schools. The theoretical and conceptual framework that I developed for this study, there are two existing theories that I've used. The first is the human capital theory. I was created in the mid-1900s, but here I put down Becker's definition, which is just sort of a simplification. He says that people gain skills or capital that makes them productive and it makes them look better to their employers, so they keep their jobs, and then that will increase the income as their employers continue to feed into them and get out what they need. England in 2005 studied the gender wage gap in the United States using this theory and found that employers are less likely to hire women in jobs that have a lot of on-the-job training because of the risk of losing them to having children or stepping down to raise the children that they have. So here's a direct example of human capital theory showing sort of what I'm looking at, except in shining a different light on it, if you will. The next is the motherhood penalty. This is a phenomenon or a theory, and it occurs in both professional and personal settings when women are either knowingly or unknowingly chastised for both bearing and having children. Some specifics in the motherhood penalty can be identified as a spousal earning gap. Chung identified this, and it was a very interesting quantitative study where there's a gap that spouses have between their incomes. And when a woman has a child, the gap grows dramatically. And it actually does not ever really come back to where it was before she had a child. So once a woman has a child, the gap between her and her husband will never be the same. Their earnings. Another theme that ties in with the motherhood penalty is the gendering of careers. And Cotter did a study and found that when the workforce opened up to women in the mid-1900s, females acquired their jobs unevenly, which caused certain occupations to become a majority female, and they've just sort of stuck that way. If you go into a hospital today in 2024, you are just as likely to have a female nurse as you were back in 1950. So some jobs are just almost permanently female. And vice versa. Some jobs are just permanently, it would seem, male. In terms of my proposed study, the current application of the human capital theory, teachers and eventually administrators, would be considered the human capital, and the school districts themselves, I would consider the employers that are investing in the capital, or their teachers and eventually administrators. As far as the motherhood penalty goes, I used several different studies to create and pull out just a simple term of it, and that is that women's career mobility is going to be hindered by motherhood. Combined, these two lead to a conceptual framework that has several assumptions. The first is that becoming a mother and taking maternity leave is an inescapable penalty to a woman's career, in part because she's going to be viewed as less valuable by her employer. The next is that the lack of a specific maternity leave policy within school districts leads to a reliance on FMLA, and it's really a representation of both theories because maternity leave does not benefit schools or school districts, nor does it increase the skill, effectiveness, or efficiency of the teacher. The district would deem it not necessary to craft a specific policy and instead just use whatever the government has. My research questions. Originally, I had several research questions, but I really narrowed it down to one with two sub-questions. The first, or the main research question, how do maternity leave policies in K through 12 public schools in Pennsylvania impact the administrative careers of women in education? My sub-questions narrow this down and they ask about different interpretations of FMLA and maternity leave policies, but their impact on those aspiring for administrative roles and and female administrators in general. The sampling design that I've created for this study, I looked at 3 counties in central Pennsylvania, found 4 school districts, in each county, 12 school districts total. Purposeful sampling is going to be utilized, and the participants that I'm looking for will be women in either principal or vice principal positions, and they've had children while being employed by a school district, and they've taken the maternity leave. Because I'm only interviewing principals or vice principals, I do want to note that sub-question 1, which, take it back, looks for aspiring administrative roles. Women who have had children while they are teachers and taken maternity leave and are now administrators can still answer this question through hindsight. So I don't feel as if I need to interview teachers that are having children that want to be administrators. I can stay with just a pool of current administrators. I also want to note that superintendents or higher admins, such as directors of different areas, they are largely male, and it's going to be more difficult to identify female participants in that role. And then the data from them might be different as well, because they will have more unique expectations, and it could skew my findings. There is no age limit nor limit to the number of pregnancies or children. Maternity leave policies basically stayed the same since FMLA, so anyone really applies. For data collection, there are 2 parts to it. The first is a policy and document analysis. I created a matrix of the 12 selected school districts. I looked at their FMLA policies or any type of policy they had available to the public. I looked for contracts and did include a link if they were available. I looked at the gender of principals and assistant principals of each school within the district. Some findings from this matrix: all 12 districts relied primarily on FMLA for their maternity leave policy, with the exception of one district that did extend leave up to a year, but it was still unpaid. Specific bargaining agreements and administrative contracts are not public information. However, they do mostly abide by school code. So when I do interview these women, I'm going to ask for specifics on the maternity leave policy that they experienced. And with my pilot study, it's been the same for every woman so far, which is it's FMLA. When I looked at these 12 districts, the ratio of female to male administrators was 46% female to 54% male. So it's slightly different than what the most recent findings are by the Center for Educational Statistics, but it's sort of what is in line with history. This is just a brief preview of the document analysis matrix that I have, just to show how I organized some of the findings. And in the interest of time, I'm just going to keep going. The primary method of my study is going to be individual interviews. They're organized with women throughout the district who will fit the criteria, and I don't know how many women that I will need to interview. I just plan to continue to go until saturation is reached. The women are going to be recruited to the study via an email, which I included in Appendix A of my proposal. I will also include a phone number, so if they want to verbally discuss things with me instead of just over email, they may feel more comfortable doing it that way before they sign up. They're going to be informed of the study through the recommended consent form by the university, which is in Appendix B. I also want to say they may skip a question or end the interview completely if they wish to. The interviews, are going to use a semi-structured interview protocol, and the questions were developed using a pilot study. My pilot study I conducted this spring, they were 4 one-on-one interviews with assistant principals and principals. Preliminary questions were asked, and then I would go back and change the questions after the results from the first interview to refine and narrow the questions down. It culminated in a series of optimal interview questions, which is found in Appendix C, and I'm going to use them during the final part of this study. And hopefully they will, because they've been tested by my pilot study, they will avoid any misunderstanding or disrespect. These are just a few sample interview questions that were developed through the pilot study. And for the sake of time, I'm just going to continue to go. It's almost done. My method for analysis, all interviews will be either audio or video recorded on a MacBook. It will use either voice memos if they are in person or Zoom if it is over Zoom. I'm also going to take notes during each interview. They're going to be transcribed within 72 hours. Zoom has a feature that allows you to transcribe all of the interviews. There's an app called ACO that electronically transcribes, so it'll just take the information from the voice memo and transcribe it. I do want to note that even though both of these are sort of outside apps, everything on them is going to be deleted once the transcription is complete, so nothing will be stored on the apps. The transcriptions themselves are going to be stored in an encryption folder on a personal computer. I'm going to use grounded theory as I analyze the transcriptions, primarily through coding. Inductively coded the excuse me as I get I'm going to inductively code to establish patterns, themes, and categories. It's going to require me to read over each transcript several times, and every important phrases or terms are going to be cataloged throughout the first stages. Typologies are going to be created, and I do have in Appendix D a matrix that it created based on Maxwell, and it just is one of the possible ways to lay out data. Lastly, the validity to ensure that my analysis is on track. The data will be triangulated, so we have the policy document analysis in part with the interviews to compare and contrast. I plan to use peer debriefing on some of my findings continuously throughout my interviews and analysis. I also plan to use member checking, so the participants will give me feedback that validates the analysis that I'm doing. An external audit will be performed further through the process with someone familiar with qualitative analysis, so they also will be familiar with the nuances of womanhood, so a female who's familiar with motherhood, maternity leave, and things like that. Lastly, the researcher bias is possible. It's always the potential. The school districts were identified out of geographical convenience, and one of them is my own, but I'm not an administrator. There's not going to be any negative pressure with the report because the school districts are unnamed, and I myself have not experienced maternity policies at all, so my bias is minimized in this study. And that brings us to the end.